So this is about economic principles for integrating adaptation into fiscal policies, and fiscal policies are all about economic development. So we have to worry about adaptation and sustainable economic development. We will read off a few things from the IMF staff notes here. Synergies between development and climate resilience. So climate resilience is kind of adaptive capacity, which we will look at how it depends on the country's economic status, developing versus developed or poor countries and so on. And adaptive capacity and resilience are related because basically if there is a disaster, how quickly you come out and recover from it and rebuild is what resilience is all about. And there are details about whether it will be a V-shaped recovery or a U-shaped recovery, how long it takes to recover, etc. And within a country itself, different systems have different characteristics of recovery, but here we are talking about a generic adaptation to climate change and not particular sectors like transportation or water system or energy system and so on. Okay, climate vulnerability and development are strongly related. Not very surprising, and yet it's very true. Development reduces climate vulnerability, and reductions in climate vulnerability facilitate economic development. So you want to reduce vulnerability, which also means enhancing resilience. Typically vulnerabilities are, they are indices constructed based on many variables. Could be like per capita GDP, education level, access to energy, water, kind of like Human Development Index as well, but can be specifically aimed at vulnerability to a particular perturbation like climate change. Okay. As a result, advanced economies are less climate sensitive than developing ones. We will see this in a figure, in a very nice figure. So there are structural differences. For example, agriculture, a vulnerable sector, contributes less to GDP in advanced economies compared to, let's say, India, where the contribution to GDP is not high, but the employment is almost 60% from the agricultural sector. So structural differences, resilient and protective infrastructure, lower poverty rates, greater financial inclusion, and more efficient insurance markets help advanced economies adapt to a wider range of climates and to deal with extreme weather. Okay, so obviously this is not the same for lower economic economies that are not advanced. Climate adaptation enhances development and reinforces a virtuous cycle. So if you are climate resilient, then it comes about from climate adaptation. So if you prioritize climate adaptation into the fiscal policy and make the people and firms more resilient, then they are less prone to shocks. Their vulnerability is reduced, so your income is not going to be affected as much by climate change perturbations. So then you get into this virtuous cycle. For example, infrastructure damaged by climate shocks are a drag on people and firms by hindering access to essential goods and services, by reducing utilization rate of key production inputs, and by forcing suboptimal input choices. The greatest benefit of climate adaptation is a more productive and stable economy in the long term and a more equitable and sustainable development. In some cases, investments in adaptation may also have environmental and employment co-benefits. So it's not just protecting against perturbations, but also have co-benefits. Always well-being, mental health, productivity, etc. are related to these co-benefits as well. The importance of development for climate resilience is reflected by strong correlations between indicators of adaptive capacity and development, which we will see in a minute. There is scope to reduce climate risks further in all countries at all levels of income starting now. There is scope to reduce climate risks further in all countries at all levels of income starting now. What does it mean? A frontier analysis estimated as a function of GDP per capita. There are some details of this. We'll see a figure, but there is some technical detail behind it which I won't go into. So a frontier analysis estimated as a function of GDP per capita can help to identify leaders and laggards compared with the peers at similar income levels. How people respond, how countries respond always depends on these things. Distance to the frontier tends to be larger in Africa and the Middle East, but there are also vast disparities within regions. So if there is the adaptation frontier, who is close to it doesn't depend just on the per capita income of the country, but on various other cultural memes and skepticism to climate and various other factors. Okay, there is potential to reduce risks and improve the overall efficiency of all economies starting from present exposure to climate hazards. Once started, this process can be built upon to address new risks from climate change. Remember that IMF is a global entity with 195 member countries, and it monitors global economic activity and risks. So it is talking about frontier analysis where all countries have to be looked at, and their risk to climate change has to be looked at, so that economic development pathways are presented in that sense. So here is a figure: development, adaptive capacity and exposure indices. First one here is adaptive capacity and GDP per capita versus exposure indices. Exposure is basically, let's say you are in the east coast of India and cyclones are your main worry. Then exposure can depend on population density, infrastructure, distance to shelters, and so on. So there is the hazard, there is the exposure, there is the vulnerability, and now there is also a response. How quickly government responds to early warnings and incidents of cyclone will determine your overall risk as well. So just keep that in mind in terms of exposure index. Large values indicate greater risk, so it goes from 0.15 to 0.65 here. And we are looking at adaptive capacity index, again another index that indicates how capable you are of dealing with the perturbation once you are exposed to a particular climate hazard. So advanced economies here, obviously their dependence, adaptive capacity is not so dependent on exposure index. Even as exposure larger values indicate greater risk, they are not so affected. And here are middle income countries, so emerging markets, and then low income countries, which are way down here. As exposure increases, their adaptive capacity drops very quickly, which is what you want to change. So you want to bend this curve upward for all. Looking at GDP per capita in dollars, again exposure index. Similarly, you have GDP per capita high for advanced economies, so doesn't depend on exposure index. In other words, people's per capita GDP is not affected so much by climate hazard, whereas for emerging markets and low income countries there is a huge dependence on the exposure, and per capita GDP is heavily affected as their exposure increases. If you look at adaptive capacity indices with this frontier analysis, so you can read off here, frontier analysis methodology, we fit a stochastic production model of log adaptive capacity with a single input, the logarithm of log GDP per capita in US dollars. Okay. I will leave it there, but you can read it. But you can see here normal GDP per capita in US dollars spec to 2018 goes from 0 to 100,000, which is of course very high. And you look at adaptive capacity. As your GDP per capita increases, your adaptive capacity increases. But of course everybody has a asymptotic limit to how much you can actually protect yourself against. Even Houston, richest neighborhoods, or New Orleans, if a cyclone or a hurricane comes, smashes the whole system, then you are really not adaptive at 100%. But again, the message is, if you look at various regions, advanced economies and European DMEs, emerging markets, and LICR, low income countries, and so on, the nominal GDP is low and adaptive capacity is low, so you want to be as close to high adaptive capacity as possible. And as we said, the per capita GDP is not the only indicator as to how far countries are. So here are some countries where you can be high in per capita GDP but still far away from the adaptive capacity frontier. Distance to adaptive capacity frontier here in percentage. Again, you can see Africa here. This is the MCD is the Middle East and North Africa, Western Hemisphere, Asia Pacific, and Europe. So you can see that distance to adaptive capacity frontier has to be small. For Africa, it is the largest here. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So we will look at success stories, maybe come back and do it in the next podcast because I don't want to extend these too far. Each concept requires some digestion, so you listen to it, you digest, you read the report if you want to fill in the gaps, since I'm only reading the headlines here. So we'll come back and look at some success stories just to see that this is not something hopeless, that there are examples of successful adaptation and there are lessons to be learned, there are transferable solutions. So mitigation, as we said, is easier to quantify, easier to track. Adaptation tends to be very empirical, local, and there is no blueprint. So each region may require developing locally suitable adaptation to reduce vulnerability and resilience and risk, and or increase resilience, reduce risk, and so on. Okay, we'll come back and continue.